The spring of 1944 brought a subtle shift in the intelligence cables streaming into Allied headquarters. Anomalies so small they could have been dismissed as routine noise. Yet within the cautious minds of MI6 analysts, one pattern stood out. Repeated reports from German defectors and intercepted messages hinted at growing unease at Adolf Hitler's mountain residence, the Berghof. What stood out was not troop deployment, nor munitions shortages, but something quieter, almost domestic: the sudden tightening of protocols around the Führer's meals. It was an overlooked corner of wartime security, but its implications were chilling. Food paranoia was not new within the Nazi hierarchy. Since at least 1939, Hitler had insisted on strict vegetarian menus and heavily controlled preparation routines. But something had changed in early 1944. Observers recorded strange irregularities: kitchen staff rotations growing shorter, guards doubling at the service entrances, and new directives emphasizing final verification of every ingredient. The focal point of these changes was a young chef, unnamed in the first reports, who was reportedly ordered to taste test every dish under watchful SS officers before it reached the Führer's table. To MI6, the re-emergence of this rumor suggested more than simple caution. It reflected a regime tightening under the pressure of Allied advances and internal fear. For Allied intelligence, the Berghof was a fortress of secrecy perched on the slopes of the Obersalzberg. The British had long struggled to penetrate its inner workings, and information about its kitchen hierarchy had always been fragmentary. But as 1944 unfolded, testimonies from captured German aides painted a picture of suffocating control. One POW formerly attached to the Reichssicherheitsdienst (RSD) claimed that Hitler believed his enemies, both foreign and domestic, would eventually resort to poisoning. He trusted no one, he told interrogators, not even those who served his meals. The chef, according to several accounts, was not a hardened SS loyalist but a civilian conscripted into service. One OSS report described her as nervous, thin, and constantly under surveillance. She reportedly lived in a small room near the kitchen block, escorted whenever she left the immediate vicinity. Before each meal, she was required to taste a selection of the dishes while armed guards waited for any sign of illness. It was a ritual repeated 3 times a day, a grim routine that revealed just how acutely Hitler feared betrayal. To contextualize this paranoia, Allied analysts looked back at the events shaking Germany during that period. By early 1944, the war was turning against the Nazi regime. The defeat at Stalingrad had shattered the myth of invincibility. The Allies were tightening control in Italy. Resistance movements across Europe were sabotaging supply lines and assassinating key officials. And within the German officer corps, murmurs of opposition to Hitler were growing bolder. MI6 had already intercepted communications suggesting that military conspirators were studying past assassination attempts, some of which relied on poison. The increased security within the Berghof kitchen aligned perfectly with the regime's growing fear of internal betrayal. One of the most revealing documents recovered by the Allies after the war was a partially translated RSD memorandum dated March 1944. It listed new directives for food preparation, including the chilling guideline. Staff responsible for tasting will remain isolated for 1 hour after initial testing. This suggests the chef's role was not symbolic. It was a frontline position in the Führer's personal security apparatus. But as the Allies pieced together these accounts, one question lingered. Who was this chef, and why had her name been scrubbed from every official record they could find? Normally, personnel files from high-ranking residences included detailed rosters. Yet in this case, key documents were missing or heavily redacted. Even among captured officers, none could confidently recall her full name, as if her presence had been intentionally obscured. To MI6 and the OSS, this was no trivial detail. The identity of someone so intimately connected to Hitler's daily survival could offer rare insights into his state of mind during the final years of the war. A chef forced to taste daily for toxins lived at the intersection of fear, control, and vulnerability, an invaluable vantage point for understanding the psychological collapse of the Nazi leadership. The mystery only deepened when a fragmentary diary entry surfaced in an OSS interrogation file. Written by an unnamed kitchen assistant, it described a scene from January 1944. She looked pale again today. The guards stood too close. When she tasted the soup, her hands shook. There was no name attached, no clear identification, only this brief, human glimpse into a role defined by coercion and dread. As Allied intelligence began tracing every available lead, one unsettling realization emerged. The chef's fate was completely unknown. No witness could say definitively what happened to her after 1945. No official report listed her evacuation, transfer, or death. She simply vanished from the record, leaving behind only rumors, scattered testimonies, and the faint outline of a life lived in constant fear. And so, with only these fragments, the investigation into the Berghof kitchen, and the chef at its center, was just beginning. The deeper the Allies dug, the more questions surfaced, pulling them toward a larger mystery that lay waiting in the shadows of the collapsing Reich. By the summer of 1944, Allied interrogation rooms from London to Algiers echoed with an unusual refrain from captured German personnel. References to a shadowed figure within Hitler's wartime residences. A young female chef reportedly trapped inside a rigid security routine. What began as scattered mentions soon took on the shape of something more substantial. OSS field officers, who typically sifted for tactical data, troop morale, fuel shortages, or strategic intentions, found themselves unexpectedly drawn toward a domestic corner of the Nazi hierarchy, the kitchens of the Wolf's Lair. This was not because the Allies suddenly cared about Hitler's diet. It was because multiple German prisoners, interviewed separately and unaware of each other's statements, described a terror-stricken cook whose role seemed far more consequential than her title implied. The Wolf's Lair, Hitler's forward headquarters in East Prussia, was a fortress of bunkers, watchtowers, and camouflage nets stretching across nearly 6.5 square kilometers of dense forest. Within its concrete walls, paranoia ran deep. Even senior officers endured layers of security checks. But what caught OSS attention was how frequently the prisoners emphasized the oppressive atmosphere around the kitchen complex itself. A former Wehrmacht adjutant, captured near Cannes, told interrogators, everyone feared the kitchen staff would become the weak link. Another, an RSD enlisted guard, stated, there was a girl. She always looked like she expected to die each day. The idea of a civilian chef caught amid Hitler's spiraling distrust was not implausible. Historical records showed the regime routinely conscripted people, especially women, into support roles around high command. But the testimonies hinted at something deeper. The chef was reportedly separated from other workers, escorted under guard, and ordered to silently endure a daily gauntlet of food tests. One prisoner even claimed she was rotated between the Wolf's Lair and the Berghof during periods when Hitler shifted between headquarters, though no paperwork confirming such transfers survived the war. What made her particularly significant to Allied analysts was not only her proximity to Hitler, but the suggestion that she observed his paranoia firsthand. In intelligence work, psychological insight into enemy leadership was rare and invaluable. Anything that revealed Hitler's deteriorating trust in his own environment mattered. By 1944, Allied agencies already understood the Führer was increasingly isolated, reliant on a shrinking circle of loyalists, and resistant to military reality. A terrified chef, forced into silence, living in the shadows of this crumbling world, might have seen things even senior aides did not. OSS Section X, responsible for personality and behavior analysis, began cross-referencing testimonies. Their internal reports highlighted converging details. The chef was young, likely in her 20s. She had been recruited from somewhere in Silesia or East Prussia, and she was firmly under SS supervision. Some prisoners described her as small and pale, others as quiet and obedient, but all emphasized her fear. One captured officer said, she walked like someone who knew one mistake meant execution. A deeper layer of intrigue surfaced when analysts examined the chronology. The heightened security around food appeared to coincide with rising tensions inside the German military leadership. The July 20th plot, the attempted assassination of Hitler by his own officers, was still weeks away, but anti-Hitler sentiment was swelling beneath the surface. OSS analysts postulated that Hitler's protective measures might have intensified because the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service, had quietly uncovered rumblings of internal dissent. The chef's increased isolation, therefore, may not have been arbitrary. It may have been a direct response to threats the Allies hadn't even learned of yet. To support their analysis, OSS officers scrutinized the operational structure of the Htlr kitchen. The facility was overseen by SS logistics officers who controlled ingredient deliveries, storage checks, and final food preparation. The chef's role, taste testing dishes before they reached Htlr, was an enforced layer of risk designed to intercept any attempted poisoning. But Allied analysts questioned why a single individual, reportedly untrained in security or medicine, would be forced into such a critical position. Why her? Why not rotate multiple staff? Why not rely on medical officers or trained testers? The lack of answers suggested intentional concealment. The mystery deepened further when a fragment of intelligence emerged from a British double agent embedded within the German communications network. He intercepted a low-level message referencing the girl assigned to the dietary guard, a phrase never seen in standard personnel records. MI6 linguistic specialists noted the unusual wording. Guard implied a defensive function, not culinary. It reinforced the theory that the chef was part of an improvised human shield, one whose existence was sensitive enough to obscure. By late July 1944, after the failed assassination attempt by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, the Htlr descended into a suffocating atmosphere of suspicion. Interrogation logs from surviving German staff captured after the war reflect an environment where anyone, from officers to clerks to kitchen workers, was scrutinized for signs of betrayal. In this climate, the chef's anxiety reportedly grew more visible. One POW recalled, "After the bomb, no one was safe. Especially not her. The guards watched her constantly." Yet despite all these converging accounts, the Allies still lacked the most essential element, her identity. Every lead ended in dead ends, missing documents, or contradictory descriptions. It was as though she had been deliberately erased. And as the OSS grew more determined to uncover the truth, another troubling thread emerged. By late 1944, references to her presence abruptly vanished from intercepted transmissions and prisoner testimonies alike. Once again she disappeared, this time not just from paperwork, but from living memory. In the first weeks following the Normandy landings of June 1944, Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park detected an unusual set of encrypted transmissions moving through secondary German military channels. These messages did not involve troop movements or supply shortages, typical intercepts by mid-1944, but instead referred to a new security initiative called Operation Cook and Watch, or Kitchen Watch. At first glance, the term appeared almost trivial amid the chaos of the collapsing Western Front. But its context, timing, and secrecy were anything but ordinary. What could prompt the German High Command to launch a named directive concerning food, kitchens, and internal protocols at the very heart of the regime? Analysts quickly discovered that the directive had been issued from a high-level SS office, with instructions disseminated to both the Berghof and the Htlr. That dual distribution was rare. Security operations were typically location-specific. The very fact that Cook and Watch spanned Hitler's two main headquarters signaled that the directive responded to a systemic fear, one that transcended geography. And at the center of this tightening net of restrictions stood the unnamed chef previously noted by OSS and MI6 across prisoner testimonies. Her role, once perceived as routine, now appeared to be a critical point of vulnerability the German leadership desperately sought to reinforce. By June 1944, internal threats against Hitler were escalating. German officers within the Wehrmacht and Abwehr were quietly coordinating plans for what would soon culminate in the July 20th bombing attempt. Resistance networks in occupied Europe were using poisoning as a low-impact, high-risk tool against local Nazi officials. In this climate, kitchen access became a national security concern. Operation Cook and Watch introduced standardized procedures for ingredient transport, sealed storage, and controlled tasting requirements. It was, in effect, a militarized restructuring of Hitler's personal food chain. A declassified British report written shortly after the war noted that the directive appeared designed to eliminate any opportunity for unsupervised food handling, with emphasis on the designated tester. The tester, analysts concluded, could only have been the elusive chef. Under Operation Cook and Watch, She was reportedly isolated for long stretches, monitored by SS personnel specifically assigned to observe her reactions after test-tasting meals. The waiting period, said to be between 45 minutes and 1 hour, was documented in later medical testimony gathered by Allied forces in Bavaria. But it was her sudden removal from routine logs after July 1944 that puzzled investigators. Prior to that, fragmentary accounts consistently placed her at either the Wolf's Lair or the Berghof, depending on Hitler's movements. After midsummer, however, those references dried up entirely. No one could pinpoint when she was transferred, reassigned, or dismissed. Even more troubling, the kitchen rosters for the late summer and autumn periods, normally preserved with bureaucratic rigidity, were missing sections or bore obvious signs of tampering. To researchers piecing together the evidence, the timing of her disappearance was as significant as the disappearance itself. Many historians later theorized that following the failed July 20th plot, the regime purged anyone deemed insufficiently vetted, or anyone whose role intersected with Hitler's immediate safety. The chef, already subjected to intrusive oversight, may have come under suspicion simply because of proximity. One POW guard recalled, "After the bomb, everyone senior in the SS believed the next attempt would be subtle. They blamed the kitchens more than the officers. What little evidence remained suggested she endured increasing pressure." One OSS document cited a testimony from a logistics clerk who survived the war, noting that the girl looked ill, like she hadn't slept. Another German prisoner described hearing rumors that she had been restricted to quarters for additional questioning, though no official interrogation record surfaced. This lack of documentation was consistent with late-war SS behavior. Many records from July to October 1944 were destroyed or handwritten in informal logs unlikely to survive combat retreats. What intrigued Allied analysts further was how coded mentions of Cook and Watch changed after July. Early messages focused on procedures, locks, seals, supervisory rotations. Later ones, however, spoke vaguely of restructured assignments and verified replacements. The shift implied personnel changes whose traces had been meticulously erased. When analysts compared these transmissions with construction logs from the Wolf's Lair and Berghof, they noticed that several supply chains involving produce, bread, and dairy were rerouted through different checkpoints after August. Whether this was because of the chef's disappearance or another security incident remained unclear. To deepen their understanding, OSS researchers reconstructed diagrams of kitchen flow patterns inside Hitler's headquarters, using testimonies from surviving staff. They identified choke points where intentional poisoning could realistically occur: ingredient reception docks, cold storage rooms, and the final preparation line. The chef's enforced role as a living safeguard now appeared not merely precautionary but essential to masking structural vulnerabilities the regime could not fix amid wartime constraints. The mystery lay not just in her duties, but in the silence that followed. Why did Operation Cook and Watch's documentation continue long after her trail went cold? Why did German messages reference replacements without naming them? And perhaps most importantly, why did no surviving staff from late 1944 or early 1945 recall a new tester taking her place? By early 1945, it was as though the system had swallowed its own witness. The Allies were left with a haunting gap, an absence where answers should have been. And with Hitler relocating back to Bavaria as the Eastern Front collapsed, the stage was set for the next discovery: abandoned administrative logs in the ruins of the Berghof, with pages missing in all the places investigators expected them the most. As the snows of early 1945 receded across the Bavarian Alps, the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division pressed deeper into the heartland of a collapsing Third Reich. Their advance toward Berchtesgaden, home to the Berghof, Adolf Hitler's mountain residence, was not only a symbolic thrust but a critical intelligence objective. Allied command hoped that seizing the compound might yield documents revealing inner fractures within the Nazi leadership. What they did not anticipate, however, was the discovery of a series of abandoned administrative logs that hinted at something far more personal and far more unsettling: the daily record of a chef forced into the role of sacrificial taster, and the abrupt, unexplained termination of her entries mere days before the German retreat from the Obersalzberg complex. It was in late April 1945 when patrols from the 7th Infantry Regiment, Moving cautiously through debris-strewn service corridors beneath the Berghof, entered a storage room partially burned but largely intact. Amid the charred edges of furniture and scattered uniforms, they found a metal cabinet containing ledger books, handwritten logs, and typed directives stamped with the insignia of the Reichssicherheitsdienst, RSD. Many documents concerned routine logistics, food inventories, kitchen rotations, delivery schedules, but one bundle, tied with frayed string, stood out. These pages contained meticulous, almost obsessive daily notations about meal preparation and testing procedures. The entries stopped suddenly 4 days before the compound was evacuated under SS orders. The logs provided a rare, near-contemporary account of Hitler's escalating paranoia regarding poisoning. Several entries included phrases such as, verification completed at 9:12, no adverse symptoms, and tester observed during 45-minute post-check interval. The wording was clinical, even detached, but the pattern was unmistakable. And toward the bottom of one page dated April 18, 1945, investigators found what appeared to be a personal scribble in different handwriting, perhaps a marginal note. She is pale again. Requests additional rest denied. Though unsigned, the note was consistent with testimonies of kitchen personnel describing a young woman forced to taste every dish under SS observation. These pages would eventually be catalogued as part of a classified OSS collection. But in those first moments of discovery, U.S. intelligence officers recognized that they might be holding the closest thing yet to contemporary evidence of the chef's existence. Previous information had been fragmentary, scattered POW testimonies, coded transmissions, missing rosters. Here, for the first time, were formal administrative logs placing a specific individual at the Berghof at a defined moment in time. Yet even in the midst of this breakthrough, one question loomed over every page. Why did her recorded activities stop so abruptly? To understand the significance of the missing days, investigators examined the broader situation around the Berghof in April 1945. U.S. aerial reconnaissance had observed intensified SS activity around the compound. Communications intercepts indicated accelerated evacuations of personnel deemed security sensitive. Hitler himself had already relocated permanently to the Führer bunker in Berlin, leaving only a skeletal staff at the mountain residence. It was a moment of extreme nervousness and chaotic decision-making, an environment in which people vanished without explanation, where documents were burned in panic, and where loyalty was measured in increasingly brutal terms. A decoded RSD directive recovered from another room in the Berghof added to the mystery. Dated April 20th, it instructed, all non-essential staff are to be removed from the premises by dusk. Special designations will remain under protective review. The meaning of special designations was not clarified, but OSS analysts later suspected that this category included personnel with intimate access to Hitler's personal routines, trusted adjutants, medical staff, and possibly the taste-testing chef. If the directive meant she remained on site after others had been evacuated, her disappearance became even more concerning. Another clue emerged from a half-burned file retrieved at the bottom of the cabinet. It contained daily meal summaries and temperature logs for stored produce. Most of the entries appeared routine, but a few were conspicuously crossed out with heavy pencil strokes. A line dated April 21st originally included a reference to testing incomplete, pending reassignment, but the words pending reassignment had been scratched over so forcefully that the paper tore. Beneath the tear, faint impressions suggested hurried handwriting added afterward, possibly reading escort ordered, though the full phrase was illegible. U.S. Army personnel interviewed surviving civilians from nearby Berchtesgaden in early May, hoping for eyewitness accounts. Several locals recalled seeing SS trucks leaving the Obersalzberg on or around April 22, carrying unidentified passengers under heavy guard. One elderly farmer claimed, "They looked frightened. Even the guards looked frightened." But when pressed on details, none could confirm whether any kitchen staff were among those removed. If the chef had been taken off-site, she may have been moved under such strict control that even locals accustomed to SS activity failed to notice her presence. The final puzzle piece came from an unexpected source. A Berghof maintenance worker, later questioned by Allied intelligence, recalled that in mid-April he was ordered to repair a damaged door hinge in the kitchen quarters. The chef's small room, located off a side corridor, was locked when he arrived. 2 guards stood outside. He overheard one say, "After tonight, it won't matter." The worker admitted he did not understand the context, but the phrasing haunted investigators. Did it refer to the impending evacuation, a reassignment, or something more final? In the end, the administrative logs did not give answers, only shape to the silence. They confirmed the chef's role, her routine, the timeline of her presence, and the moment her record vanished. But the unresolved 4-day gap before the evacuation left investigators with a deeper mystery than before. And as the Allies expanded their inquiry beyond the Berghof, another layer of confusion awaited them. Conflicting testimonies from the very people who had lived and worked under the same roof as the vanished chef. In the first months after Germany's surrender, the Allied intelligence community, MI6, OSS, and later the Strategic Services Unit, turned its attention from battlefield operations to the painstaking reconstruction of what had happened inside Hitler's inner orbit. They sought not only political and military insights, but personal ones. Who had been near Hitler in his final years? Who had witnessed the erosion of his authority? And who had simply vanished before the Reich fell? At the center of these inquiries was the elusive figure uncovered in fragments of logs at the Berghof, a chef-turned-taster whose presence had been unmistakably recorded, yet whose fate was an absolute void. If answers existed, they would lie within the testimonies of surviving staff. Interrogation teams fanned out across the American and British occupation zones, tracking down everyone from former SS guards to clerks, kitchen assistants, and logistical workers who had served either at the Berghof or the Wolf's Lair between 1943 and 1945. But the moment investigators began asking about the chef, contradictions erupted. Some interviewees claimed to remember her vividly. Others insisted no such woman had ever worked in Hitler's kitchens. A few spoke with confidence, only to contradict their own timelines minutes later. The more testimonies the Allies gathered, the more tangled the truth became. One of the earliest interviews was with a former SS Unterstscharführer assigned to the Reichssicherheitsdienst. Detained near Innsbruck, he told MI6 officers that he recalled a quiet girl in her 20s who always stood apart from the others. He claimed she had been present during the tense days after the July 20, 1944 assassination attempt, and that her fear was obvious to anyone who looked. Yet when pressed about her disappearance, he hesitated. Some said she was transferred to a safe location, he offered. Others whispered she was interrogated. When asked to identify her in a lineup of wartime staff photos, he shook his head. If any of these were her, I don't remember. A second witness, a kitchen assistant named Gerda Bauer, provided a more personal account. She told OSS investigators in Munich that she once shared a brief conversation with the chef near the storage cellar. She told me she was from Silesia, Bauer recalled. She missed her family. She said she had volunteered for service work, but she never expected this. However, Bauer's testimony raised questions. Volunteer labor was rare for positions within the Führer's protective zone. Most staff were vetted, assigned, or conscripted, never self-selecting. When investigators pointed this out, Bauer seemed startled. Perhaps she only said that to make herself feel better, she murmured. Or perhaps she was warned not to reveal the truth. The contradictions only grew sharper. A former medical orderly attached to Hitler's entourage insisted the chef had been dismissed months before the Berghof was evacuated. She was too nervous, he said. They replaced her with a male cook from Berlin. But when shown the administrative logs from April 1945, which clearly referenced a female tester, the orderly became visibly agitated and retracted his statement. Perhaps I am confusing dates, he said. Everything happened fast then. Other testimonies bordered on rumor. A guard claimed she had been executed by the SS for failing to follow procedure, an assertion unsupported by any known directive, document, or second-hand account. Another suggested she fled with villagers to avoid interrogation. Yet no civilian records mentioned a young woman matching her description seeking refuge in the surrounding area. The most intriguing testimony came from a former supply officer captured in the British zone. Unlike others, he spoke calmly and with detailed memory. He described the chef as intelligent, soft-spoken, and terrified. He recalled seeing her escorted by 2 guards during the final week before the Berghof evacuation. She looked ill, he said. Not from poison, but from exhaustion. Her hands shook constantly. When asked where she went afterward, the officer paused. I believed they took her to a secure facility. But later, no one spoke of her. Not even the guards. The conflicting accounts frustrated Allied analysts. Some believed the chaos of the war's end simply erased her trail. Others suspected deliberate concealment. The absence of paperwork, the inconsistent memories, and the rapid destruction of documents by the SS in April 1945 all suggested the chef's disappearance may not have been incidental. It may have been orchestrated. MI6 investigators considered several theories. The first was evacuation, that she had been relocated under guard and disappeared among the countless displaced persons in the final days of the war. A second darker possibility was that the SS eliminated her to protect sensitive information about Hitler's routines, health, and paranoia. A third theory involved forced conscription into post-surrender intelligence purges. Targets deemed security risks by senior Nazis were sometimes removed without record. Yet each theory faltered under scrutiny. The Allies found no witness who had seen her alive after April 1945, no record of her execution, and no documented evacuation route matching her profile. The most perplexing clue came from a British intelligence memo noting that several key staff members from the Berghof later insisted they did not recall a female taster, despite evidence placing her there weeks before. The pattern hinted at collective silence, whether from fear, confusion, or instruction. It was as though an entire chain of personnel had agreed, consciously or unconsciously, to let her memory dissolve. Thus, as 1945 drew to a close, the Allies faced a paradox. They had more evidence of her existence than ever before, yet every attempt to pin down her identity, movements, or fate only made her story more elusive. The mystery would deepen still further in the following year, when an unsigned, fragmented memoir surfaced in an Allied archive, one bearing the unmistakable tone of someone who had lived in the shadows of Hitler's fear. In the winter of 1946, nearly a full year after the chaotic end of the war, a thin envelope quietly surfaced in a London archive maintained by the remnants of the OSS European Division. It contained a set of handwritten pages, faded, fragmented, and unsigned, purporting to be the personal account of someone who had worked inside Adolf Hitler's kitchen staff. The handwriting, neat but hurried in places, matched no known sample in Allied files. Yet the content carried a distinct and unsettling authenticity. Precise descriptions of kitchen layouts, patrol schedules, and the suffocating pressure of taste testing the Führer's meals. For investigators who had spent months chasing shadows, these pages offered something extraordinary. A potential first-person voice from the very individual who had eluded them since the war's final days. The pages were not structured as a formal diary. Instead, they resembled reflections written after the fact. Memories poured hastily onto paper, as though the author feared she might not live long enough to finish. Some sections were missing. Others ended mid-sentence. But scattered throughout were details that aligned with the Berghof logs discovered by U.S. forces in April 1945. References to the hour of watching, the men with rifles at the door, and the quiet walk from the tasting room to the corridor, always under escort, mirrored procedural notes found in official RSD documents. These consistencies gave the memoir weight that no interrogation or coded intercept had previously offered. Yet as promising as the document seemed, its origin raised immediate questions. How had it arrived in the archive without routing labels or provenance? Why were some pages copied on cheap post-war stationery while others showed the faint watermark of late-war German government paper? Investigators debated whether the memoir had been smuggled out by a surviving staff member, recovered from a destroyed SS cache, or even written under duress. But one aspect appeared undeniable. Whoever wrote the pages possessed intimate knowledge of the daily terror inside Hitler's kitchen. The narrative itself oscillated between fear, resignation, and a reluctant sense of duty. One passage read, "I tasted first, always first. They watched not to protect me, but to see if I fell." Another noted, "If he suspected one of us, he spoke less. He ate less." The silence was its own warning. These lines suggested not only the physical danger of being a taster, but the psychological collapse radiating outward from Hitler's inner circle. The author also described a moment that caught the full attention of Allied analysts. An evening in April 1945, when she was reportedly ordered to remain in her quarters under guard. She wrote, "The corridor was quiet. Too quiet. I asked if I had done something wrong. No one answered." This date, if accurate, aligned with the 4-day gap in the Berghof administrative logs. It was the final recorded mention of any kitchen staff before the compound's evacuation. If the chef herself penned these words, they represented the last known trace of her before she vanished. But the memoir complicated the timeline even further. In one section, the writer claimed she was told she would be transferred away from the mountain, though the destination was left blank. In another, she described hearing SS officers argue in the hallway outside her door, one insisting she be kept on site due to special knowledge, another demanding she be removed for her own safety. The contradiction mirrored the very confusion found in Allied witness testimonies. Even those inside the Berghof seemed unsure of her final status. Perhaps the most haunting part of the memoir came near its end, if indeed the final page was the end at all. The handwriting grew uneven, the sentences clipped. The author wrote, "I do not know if I will be taken with them. I do not know if I will survive the next day." Then abruptly, "If anyone finds this, know that I did what I was forced to do." The sentence ended there. No signature. No date. No indication of what followed. Allied analysts debated the memoir's authorship for years. Some believed it was unquestionably written by the missing chef, pointing to matching procedural details, consistent tone, and references that only an insider could make. Others argued it could be a composite document, perhaps drafted by another staff member who witnessed her plight. A smaller number warned that the memoir might even be a post-war fabrication, though no evidence emerged to support such skepticism. What no one could dispute was the emotional resonance. The fear was real. The knowledge was specific. And the silence after the final line was absolute. By 1947, the Allied investigation reached an impasse. No additional documents surfaced. No further witnesses came forward. The chef's name, never recorded with certainty, remained absent from personnel rosters. And despite exhaustive searches across displaced persons camps, interrogation files, and captured German archives, no record of her survival or death was ever found. Historians would later describe her as one of the war's unwritten figures, a person whose life intersected with world-shaping events yet dissolved into the chaos that followed. Her existence is preserved only in fragments: administrative logs, half-remembered testimonies, coded messages, and an unsigned memoir that may or may not have been her last attempt to speak. And so the mystery endures, a young woman forced into the role of human shield against Hitler's fear, whose final days remain lost to history, leaving behind only a fading echo of courage in the face of terror, an unresolved story buried in the shadows of a collapsing regime.